In the airport, my Uncle Scott Miller warned me with a cold tone. Don't ever harbor feelings you shouldn't have. When I came back to the country with a little child in my arms later, he was shocked. Yours? I nodded with a smile. Yeah. About a month after I gave birth, I was in an airplane. I was still feeling a little spaced out. I never thought I would have had the chance to return home after staying overseas for 5 years. Scott had told me to never appear in front of him ever again. However, he was also the one who had personally bought me the air ticket. We finally landed after transiting twice, just so I could come back to join his and Bethany White's wedding anniversary. When we were on the plane, Alana had been sleeping soundly. But the moment got off the plane, she started throwing a tantrum. Mommy, my feet hurt. When I heard Alana sobbing quietly, I quickly picked her up and walked over to the exit. Once I was at the exit, I pulled out my phone and was going to get a cab. However, it started to ring as soon as I pulled it out. I looked at the string of familiar numbers that appeared on my screen, and I wasn't sure if I should pick it up. In the end, I decided not to. However, the second call quickly came in. I let out a sigh and picked it up. Scott's voice came from the other side instantly. Despite not speaking with him for a few years, I found his voice hadn't changed at all. You're out of immigration? I've arranged for my personal assistant, Robin, to pick you up. When Scott said those words, he sounded like he was conducting business. It was as if he was trying to avoid sounding familiar with me. I let out a bitter smile. I can get a cab. There was a short moment of silence. Scott probably didn't expect me to say that. He had taken extremely good care of me for a few years in the past, with people taking care of my every need. I never needed to take a cab. After a brief pause, Scott calmly said, I think it's better for Robin to come over. I've bought you something to use as a gift for your Aunt Bethany. You'll find it in the trunk. When you're over for a meal, you can take the gift with you. Scott was still as considerate as ever. He had even thought about the gift already. It wasn't out of my imagination, though. He had spent hundreds of thousands just to decorate the wedding venue, as well as going to an auction to bid on a rare diamond, just so he could commission a unique wedding ring for Bethany. I could tell he was in love with her. I understand, I answered in a low voice as I massaged my forehead. Scott stopped talking, but he didn't hang up either. After a long pause, Scott finally said something again. Quinn, I hope you've really learned your lesson after spending 5 years overseas. If you do anything to Bethany, you'll be sorry. I was stunned when I heard those words. All the white noise around me seemed to have disappeared. Scott had just told me that I would be sorry. Before I could say anything, he had already hung up. To be honest, Scott didn't have to worry. I wouldn't do anything to them. I simply wanted to raise Alana and find a job. When I left the airport, I lowered my head. When I was 22 years old, I never would have thought my life would take such a turn for the worse. It was on my 22nd birthday that Scott forced me to go overseas that he found my diary. When I was young, something happened to the yacht that my parents were on and never came back. Scott took care of me after that. We had a pretty good relationship. When I became an adult, I realized I wasn't treating Scott as just my uncle. I loved him, but I knew very well that we would have no future. That was why I wrote all my thoughts into the diary. If Scott never found my diary, I would most likely still pretend that my love for him was familial in nature. It was a niece's love for his uncle. However, when Scott saw it, he tore my diary into pieces. How can you have such disgusting thoughts? You know I'm your uncle, right? Your mother's younger brother? Even if we're not blood related, the most we can ever be is uncle and niece. Scott, who had always been a gentleman, was no longer tender to me. He roared at me with disgust in his eyes. I wanted to explain to him, but there was nothing I could say. The only thing I could do was to keep on apologizing. However, Scott didn't calm down at all. The next day, he called my workplace that I was due to start and informed them I would be resigning. Then, he shipped me off to a university in the middle of nowhere in another country using further studies as an excuse. He even sent me bodyguards to make sure that I wouldn't have any contact with the outside world. In the beginning, I didn't understand why he treated me like this. Only during my first month overseas did I find out Scott had someone he loved for many years when news of his wedding hit the top searches. I had watched the video of his wedding multiple times. In the video, Scott would look at Bethany with gentle and sentimental eyes. He had never looked at me with those kinds of eyes. At that moment, I knew that Scott had taken care of me for all these years out of pity and obligation. "Miss Parker, please." A man's voice pulled me back into reality. It was Scott's personal assistant, Robin. I nodded and got into the car with Alana already sleeping soundly in my arms. When he saw Alana, there was surprise in his eyes. "Miss Parker, she's—" I put my finger on my lips, worrying that my chat with him would wake Alana up. Only when I got into the back seat did I whisper back to him, "My daughter." Robin nodded and said nothing else. When Robin drove the car to our destination, I was a little stunned that it was the hotel where Scott and Bethany had their wedding. For all 5 years of their marriage, Scott would organize a wedding anniversary party every year. He would also personally choose a gift for Bethany. I think he must be very protective of Bethany. In the first few years, he refused to let me even show my face in their world. And this year, the only reason he called me back was to witness their happiness. That I got out of the car a little numb. Then I saw Bethany, who was standing by the street, walking over with a smile on her face. Unlike me, who was plainly dressed, Bethany was wearing expensive jewelry and had perfume on her. Seemed like Scott had taken good care of her. Bethany's smile froze suddenly. I knew she had seen Alana in my arms. As expected, she was full of shock as she stood next to me. "Why didn't you tell me that you have a daughter overseas, Quinn? Do you still treat me like an outsider even though I've been married to your uncle for so long?" I hadn't even said anything yet, but Bethany had already tried to grab Alana from my arms. Alana woke up because of the noise and she immediately cried. She wriggled, refusing to stay still in Bethany's arms. I took Alana back from Bethany and consoled her that in truth, Bethany knew that I was secretly in love with Scott. This time I didn't want to interact too much with Bethany, but she still stubbornly wanted to hang on to Alana. When Bethany and I got into the hotel's private room, Alana was still crying and wanted me to hold her instead. Bethany forced a smile and put Alana back in my arms. "Scott knows that it's difficult for us to have children, so we never tried having our own in the past few years. I just got too excited when I saw you have a daughter." There were already a few people in the room. I wasn't used to socializing with others, so I picked a spot in the corner. Meanwhile, Bethany sat down next to me and held my arm as if we were very close. She then introduced me and Alana to the others. I could tell how others were judging me. I couldn't stand the strange atmosphere and let them know I was going to the washroom. After I washed my face and came back, I then heard Bethany's voice. Someone asked, "Why did you bring someone as notorious here?"